I'm going to break into color a little bit. And this is a little bit of a wandering lecture, but I wanted to show you a bunch of images of artists who use primarily pastels in colors. But I wanted to go over some basic terminology when we talk about color. And then also talk about some of the color wheel and give you guys some kind of orientation. This color wheel right here is, sorry for it's a crummy slide, but the way that this one works is that these are what are called subtractive primary colors. And so, and this might get a little convoluted, but bear with me. And I am recording this, so you can go back and check it out. There are two primary color models that we deal with when we're dealing with art. The first and the most kind of ubiquitous is what's called the subtractive color model. And this is more like physics. So for example, when we paint, or if you use like colored pencils, what's happening is that the sun is shining down on a color or on an object, and the object that you see is actually not the color in actuality. It's not, I mean, well, let me put it like this. And you guys probably already know this, but when the sun shines on an object and when it appears to us as a green or a blue or whatever, what's happening there is pretty much all objects on Earth, including plants, the ocean, you, me, your clothing, they are energy sponges. And they absorb certain wavelengths of light from the sun, and then there are others that they do not absorb. And when they don't absorb those wavelengths coming from the sun, they kick it back out. So it kind of bounces off of them, almost like a wavelength mirror. Now, our eyes are designed to pick up different kinds of wavelengths that are bouncing off of different objects, mainly because the objects in the world are not absorbing those wavelengths of light. So you could argue that when we're looking at the world and we're going, oh, that's a green leaf, or that's a blue ocean, or that's an orange sunset, what we're really looking at is we're looking at the colors that whatever is creating those, that refraction, those colors are actually the bounced back rays and wavelengths of light from the object that it is not absorbing. So the way our eyes pick up stuff is our eyes pick up wavelengths of light that gets bounced back. So for example, when you're mixing yellow, so when we're talking about what's called a subtractive color model, and the reason why it's called subtractive is that very reason that objects are like sponges. And you could also argue that paints operate a lot like sponges, or even pastels or colored pencils. So when you see a red colored pencil, or when you see the color red, now right now on the screen, we are dealing with what's called an additive color model. And I'll go over that in a minute. And the computer has made that more important for our purposes than in the past. We would just ordinarily, do the subtractive color model. When you're dealing with paint or colors, like with a colored pencil, what you're doing is think about it like you're laying down color that is almost like a light absorbent thing, and what's being kicked back would be like the red wavelengths that your eyes are picking up. And in that sense, that's why it's called subtractive, because the colors, the light is being absorbed and subtracted from the composite light, as you guys probably know, like from 8th grade or whenever you were in science class, and you put a prism in front of the sunshine. The sunlight is white, and it contains all the wavelengths of every color, and then of course the prism creates a spectrum of them so that we can see them in sort of an order. So the primary colors are red, blue, and yellow in a subtractive color model. So this would be applicable to paint, chalk, colored pencil. If, however, we're playing around with light, like for example, a digital camera or on the computer, the primary colors there are red, green, and blue. And the red, green, and blue mix to, those are the additive color model, means that the colors like this, you see, so here's red, green, and blue, When the additive color model operates, what happens is the colors of blue and red are added together to create a magenta. When blue and green are added together, it creates cyan, and when red and green are added together, the combination of those wavelengths is yellow. So you can even, if you want to just like flick a little speckle of water on your screen or even on your smartphone, you'll start to see that there are little RGB sensors that are lit at different brightnesses on your device. So I thought I would go over some of the terms of color theory. Sorry for this janky, I kind of borrowed this, been using this for years, and okay. So in a subtractive model, okay, we're dealing with red, the primary colors are red, blue, and yellow. And in a subtractive color model, when you add those things together, you get secondary colors. The secondary colors are violet or purple, green, and of course orange, right? Now, depending upon, I'll go over mixing colors in a little bit. Intermediate colors, or also called tertiary colors, are colors that are created by mixing a primary and a secondary color. And then you can, and so there is some kind of an order to it. So if we're mixing a primary color, say of red, a secondary color of like orange, then we get, right, we get this kind of red orange color. That's kind of, it makes a lot of sense, right? So, or orange yellow. So there are also neutral colors, which we might call like a grayscale. They go from all the way black to all the way white, and then in between are shades of gray. And in a strict color sense, the grays and the blacks and the whites are what you would call like would be black and white, or color, or it'd be like a grayscale in like a Photoshop image. So just some terms that you should know if you guys go on to take maybe a painting class or something like that. If you add white to a color, that's called a tint. If you add black to a color, it's called a shade. And if I were to go back to, so the tints are going to be lighter. So as you add white, it's going to get lighter, and as you add black, it's going to get darker toward black. And maybe what I can do, I don't know if, do any of you guys use Photoshop frequently enough that using a Photoshop, that's okay, Asusana, if you're stuck on mute. I was wondering if I could just open up Photoshop for a minute. Well, actually, no, I won't do it because it'll just confuse you guys. Color schemes. So for example, a scheme is just sort of a system of putting colors together. And so when you're working on a drawing, or maybe you're working on an art piece, sometimes what artists will do is they'll just pick a scheme, a color scheme, so that they know that there's going to be some kind of a harmony within their artwork that's going to work. Monochromatic would be, somewhat like, say, like grayscale, right? Complementary would mean that you would have like kind of like the Fauves. So I'll show you some of that work later. Analogous colors mean that colors are very similar to one another. And then warm and cool. And I'm going to show you guys today how to go through and identify different types of colors, and the way that I do it, which is using kind of a method where I start asking, what is the color? Is it warm? Is it cool? Is it a tint? Is it a value? And then you can, or a shade, and then you can start to kind of hone in on how to make it. So a monochromatic could be a grayscale, but it means that when there's more or less the same color, like it doesn't divert, there's not really any purples or yellows or any of that kind of stuff in this image, just blues. Complementary colors, obviously, are going to be, let me go back, by the way. The complement of a color on the color wheel is the color that resides across from it. So the primary colors here would be red, blue, yellow, right? But the complement of blue is not yellow or red, it's orange. like you think about like the Lakers, for example, LA Lakers, whatever you think of them, they have purple and like and an orange blue, so they're playing off of those complementary colors, right? The complement of red is green and vice versa. In fact, it was an old painter's trick before they used paper to plaster big giant billboards where they would paint the signs. And sometimes red, believe it or not, is not a terribly visible color across, say, like a landscape. But green and red, if you put a green, sometimes what the sign painters would do is they would have, like, let's say you have like, you know, come buy a burger or whatever in red letters. But instead of outlining it in black, what they would do is outline parts of it in green, which would be the exact complement of that color. And what happens when you put two complementary colors together is that your eyes seek to try to find some kind of a resolution to those two colors. And in some respects, in some cases, have you ever seen like somebody wearing a certain color, or you've seen an image where the colors seem to almost wiggle against each other? That's where you're playing around with two colors that are complements. Pardon me, guys. Complements. And the complementarity, the purity of that color can tend to kind of mess with the sensors in your eyes, the rods and cones, that, and then your brain is, it's basically when those colors kind of vibrate, it's when your brain is not quite able to resolve both. Analogous colors are colors that are usually along the same, in the same neighborhood on the color wheel. So for example, if you, and I'll go back to the color wheel and talk about it again. So over here, this would be like warm colors, right? And so this is one way that I use to try to help you guys identify different colors before you start to draw. We're gonna work from some still life images for this next project. And I haven't put it up yet, so I'll put it up this evening. And I have a number of photos and then also some paintings that I will post up for you guys to use your chalk on. So if you haven't got your chalk yet, definitely try and pick up some chalk pastels Wednesday or by Wednesday or over the weekend. But let me know how you're set up. Cool colors are, if we use the color wheel as an organizational strategy, then the cool colors are on one side, the warm colors are on another side. Okay. This is an artist named Odilon Redon, and he was an artist who lived in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and he was part of a group of artists called the Symbolists. He's French, and he was really famous for using chalk pastels in really vibrant, interesting ways. A lot of his subject matter revolved around mythological themes or religious kind of themes, but not religious like in the Renaissance, where you might have kind of a reenactment of, like, you know, I don't know, the Sabine women, or, you know, some kind of biblical thing like the ascension or what, any of that kind of stuff. Usually what he'll do at this point in time for his artwork is he'll invoke the image of a figure who is linked to a spiritual or religious practice. This in particular, and I'll put this up as a PDF for you guys to look at. You can see here that there's kind of a modeling involved, and this is pastel chalk. And what's kind of neat, this is kind of a dulled down image. I've seen these in real life in France, and they're really, really vibrant. They're just unbelievable. So definitely recommend checking them out. The colors, this doesn't even do it justice. When you see it in real life, it's like vibrant and vivid. This is also Odilon Redon. And you can see how he's playing around with the vividness of colors. So if you look at this blue, you look at this red, you look at this sort of green back here, the colors almost kind of like vibrate. Yeah, it's gorgeous. It really is amazing. This is called the Buddha, also Odilon Redon. And I just wanted to, I'm going to show you a variety of artists who've used pastel and color, because I kind of feel like paint is also, you know, just like, it's just color. It's color, just a different medium. This is also Odilon Redon. just look at this, the pure use of color where the image, where it has a subject matter, but it's almost like the balance of like the subject matter in the painting or the drawing, I mean, um, it almost sort of looks as important as all the colors in the background. So when I look at this work, I don't go up to it and go, oh, it's just a picture of some people in a boat. Actually, what it to me is talking about is the sky, and I think this is called flower sky. He did a lot of floral arrangements, and then he had this whole series of work where he would do the more kind of symbolic kind of pieces. But he has a huge collection of these images where he is doing this kind of beautiful color work with flowers. You guys all probably know Frida Kahlo. I think I talked to you a little bit about her before. There she is with her little pet deer. She, as a young woman, I think she was like 15, she was in a horrible bus accident where some piece of of a pipe or something from the bus or something like that went like through her body, and it actually exited out part of her pelvis, which put her in a body cast for a year. And while she recovered, her father had bought her some paints um, just to pass the time, because she was literally, she just couldn't move. And so she started, and you can imagine how depressed you get if you're just in a body cast. And this was in like the 19 teens, I think. And she just started painting and started to paint like how she felt, right? And so as when she recovered, or as much as she possibly could have, she became an artist, and along the way met Diego Rivera, who was a very famous Mexican muralist, and did some murals for the United States as well. He was a part of a group called the Three Greats, or Los Tres Grandes, the three biggies, and that was Orozco, Rivera, and I think Tamayo, and they're the three men artists. But she did a lot of work. You could see, actually, let me go back and I'll show you. So here's when she's working on the piece I'm about to show you. So that's how big it is. And there's the finished work. These have titles, I'll put them in the PDF, but they're very narrative. And you can see like what was unique about her painting at the time, Diego Rivera was a muralist and a painter, and some of what they focused on, they were friends with a guy named Leon Trotsky. I feel like a sneeze is coming on, guys, sorry. And sorry. The work that they did was very narrative. Means it told stories. It was very linked to history, personal identity, and you can see some of her earlier paintings really address the idea of the body. Like, are we our bodies, or are we what we think? And how is our body linked to other systems, right? And so she painted these really beautiful works that explored. This is the pillar, which was her spine. She had to make sure that her spine was in all the prickles, and just so it almost feels like surrealist, but it's really like kind of like what you call like personal narrative. And that was a word. The personal narrative was a kind of work that started to really come up as a contemporary art force in the 1970s, but people have been doing it forever. And keep in mind, what's unique about this is that for almost all of history, the art that was created by painters like Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and so on, all the way up until I'd say like maybe the early 19th, maybe mid 19th century, the themes that artists would use, this is Odilon Redon again, but the themes that artists would paint or draw were usually limited to biblical themes, at least in Europe, or the themes that were dictated by the powers that be. It could be a leader, it could be Islam, it could be Confucianism, it could be any number of isms, right? But in the 19th century, people began to start looking around and painting each other. And instead of painting these idealized situations about saints or a political or sort of a famous like event, like the sinking of the Lusitania or whatever, artists started to paint their own personal representations of their own personal psychology and their own personal relationships, say with things like spirituality or peace or war or whatever. So the role of this is an artist named Puvis de Chavannes, and he is also a symbolist, a contemporary of Odilon Redon. Very like they had a lot of kind of visual tropes that they used, the symbolists, to evoke something that was more eternal and less linked only to, say, like biblical themes, religious themes, political themes. Vincent van Gogh, same kind of idea, late 1800s. As an artist, this is a time where the industrialization of Europe, the United States, and the colonial occupation of much of the rest of the world, as the sort of global economy started to kind of create itself, if you want to say it like that. Artists in particular, I'll talk about Western Europe in this lecture. Artists began to do a whole lot of different things, but one of the things that freed them up was that there was a broader availability for paint. So paint and materials were not as exclusive as they once were, and artists were able to access more materials. Things were more affordable. Colors were becoming more varied, and also the subject matters that they painted became more local. And so this is also Van Gogh. And we mostly know him for like sunflowers and stuff like that, but he started out early doing drawings of peasants and everyday people. And that was a real shift because one of the things, this is an artist named Paul Klee. I'll talk about him in a moment, but one of the things that artists were doing in the 19th century, we're talking like 1800s, right? Was to start to move away from general themes and start to move into themes that had more of a political bent. So you might think like, oh, there's just some guy sowing seeds, right? But keep in mind that the artwork up until, say, like the 19th century, in most places, even longer, really stuck to the big picture items like God, religion, power, or mythological themes that were far enough away from everyday life that art was really seen as this sort of like a deliverance from the everyday toil of life. But artists in the 19th century were saying, well, wait a minute, if let's say this meaning thing's really out there, let's say that like, that if we paint meaning of saints and all this kind of junk, yeah, he's definitely interesting dude, Vincent van Gogh. One of the things that they were refocusing on was, well, if human beings are in some ways some mirror of the great beyond, then why wouldn't we paint ourselves? Why wouldn't we not just famous people or kings or saints or any of that kind of stuff? Why don't we just paint everyday people? Like, wouldn't it make sense that since there's this mirror thing going on with God and or whatever you want to call it, and the world below us, that could it be that there's beauty in everyday stuff? There's beauty in, this is Paul Klee, in imagination and rhythm, right? He worked for, there was a school called the Bauhaus in Germany in the 1920s. And this is also Paul Klee. I'm kind of jumping around, but Paul Klee was a teacher at a school called the Bauhaus, and the Bauhaus was an experimental art school in Germany, where they were really trying to figure out, like, can we merge beauty, meaning, and function in an economically feasible way for most people? So, for example, they had furniture design, they had fabric arts, they had ceramics, they had all this different kind of stuff that they were really focusing on. And it was kind of, and the way that the educational model went was it was really rooted in the idea first, and then kind of applying materials to it later. But concurrent with the education, this is a little bit different than arts education now, is that there was a real focus on teaching people how to do stuff first, like how to draw, how to do ceramics, how to do this, how to do that. And then as your hands became more fluent in the making of things and drawing of things and painting of things, that later then the idea part would be more focused on, like, what do you care about, like what are you interested in, and that way. So for example, I was thinking about like doctors, and or this is also Paul Klee, you guys, I'm going to show you some more. I was thinking about doctors, and I remember talking to one time I was in the hospital with some help visiting a friend, and kind of asking questions, and he says, well, you know, what you have to understand is like doctors, like, because I was talking about how we don't really understand like what's going on and why does it seem so distant and da da da. And finally was one guy said something really interesting. He's like, you know, when you start medical school or any kind of a school, like even think about it, like this is called Ancient Sound by Paul Klee, who was also a musician. The doctor guy said, you know, like let's say you're like a chemist or like, you know, you're a geneticist or whatever, like they have their own language. And so for example, like I had a stomach ache the other day. I looked online, what's wrong with me? Am I going to die? Like what most of us do. So I went on Google and I looked up the anatomy of, like, you know, your gastronomic anatomy. And there was a picture of the stomach, and there were all these kind of crazy words that identified all the bits of the stomach. And then I started to look up what the crazy words meant, and it was just like upper stomach, lower stomach, medium stomach, you know, like, but they just had to create their own language to talk about it. So in the same respects, the Bauhaus artists, one of the beliefs in that art education was, if we can teach people the new visual language, which also includes sort of that tactility, like hands, right? Then you could also think it would be also almost like you're teaching somebody a new language. And with that new language, you can begin to think and you can begin to conceptualize with the tools that you have, right? Okay. And this is Ingrid Garten. She was a colorist. This is Paul Klee. Just showing you, this is Paul Signac, who was or no, Paul Serrault, Georges Serrault, sorry, not Paul. And Serrault was a pointillist painter. I think this is Serrault too. And these are all made with dots. This is Artemisia Gentileschi. Sorry, guys. Artemisia Gentileschi. This is a female Renaissance painter. And this is The Death of Holofernes. A different painting, yeah. So a lot of times in the Renaissance, the color scheme or color schemes of these paintings are very similar. And part of that had to do with the availability of different kinds of colors, right? This is Matisse, right? So if we go from the Renaissance here to Matisse, Matisse is using pure color and pure shapes right on the edge of kind of identifiability. Now, I went over Cubism with you guys, and I had a class called Matisse and Picasso, and they were contemporaries. Picasso and Braque were going after, at the time, this is when we're going after kind of a language of abstraction, where they were looking at Cubism, and they were really kind of trying to figure out a visual honesty that they could bring to bear upon the world when they were painting. Matisse had a different point of view about that same conundrum, and it had to do with color and form. Matisse spent a lot of time in the I think in Morocco. And one of the things that once you start to kind of think about that, and you start to think about Islamic architecture, oftentimes what is not there is also as important as what is there. So for example, if you look at, say, like even in Japan, you can have there's those beautiful wooden screens, not shoji screens, but they're those woven kind of wooden screens, and I'm forgetting what they're called. But there's a real interplay between what is not there and what is there. And so Matisse was starting to play around with that idea of the balance between space and then materiality. So like if you look here in this picture, down here you have these sort of voids, which we understand are seeing through the chair, right? And then beyond into a window. But then also he has this kind of thing going on where, much like the Cubists, he's sort of flattening space out for us to look at. This is an artist named Jackson Pollock. This is a really close-up of one of his paintings. He was an artist who lived, I think I showed you a little bit of his work, but he was an artist who lived in the early part of the 20th century. He became really famous for drip paintings. This is a terrible slide. I'm going to keep going. That's Alice Neal. I don't know why I have that in there. This is Moreau is the guy's name. He was also a symbolist. You can see like this is a very different, like whereas in the Renaissance you would have like angels and stuff kind of flying around with their robes everywhere, and you can see things have taken a decided shift here. I don't remember who. This is Renoir, and he was one of the Impressionists. Again, I'm hopping around. This is the late 1800s. What's unique, I'm sure you guys have probably seen Renoir, but what's unique about like the 19th century, which I think kind of made a real shift in the way that artists operated, was the changing of the focus from the grand story, the big story, the historical, the religious, to the micro story. So paying attention to the everyday beauty of just hanging out. And so in some respects, it's almost like you almost get like these sort of like photographic documents of a particular slice of time. And so the one of the like, whereas say in the where you have the cubists asking, you know, how do we honestly represent a world in two dimensions that never sits still? The Impressionists were saying, how can we honestly represent the fleetingness of life, the fleetingness of the beauty of color and light? So for example, when you're watching a sunset, or you're watching the light fade as it, you know, so, like sometimes in my backyard, I just go out and the light is really gorgeous at night and I just sit and watch it go, but it doesn't stay like that. It's always changing. And so just as where the cubists were trying to get as much kind of still in a world that always moves and thinking about space, the Impressionists were thinking about that slice of life moment of capturing the beauty of the everyday. This is an artist named Marie Cassatt, and she was also an Impressionist, and she focused more on domestic mothers and daughters, women, whereas the men in the group were doing landscapes and, you know, horse races and junk like that. This is also Marie Cassatt. And just think about the color, like look at how beautiful these colors are. And also, let me go back. When we look at a color scheme, what's really interesting and beautiful about a lot of these paintings is that they have a coherence beyond simply just their composition. There's also a coherence and kind of a rhythm that flows from using colors that are tonally similar in this way, right? So it is believable. If I go back to the Matisse, even these have a tonal similarity, right? There's nothing really bumping out. I'm going to show you some Fauvist work later where we'll compare this. But even the yellow and the blues and the reds in this have a kind of mutedness to them. Jackson Pollock also. And so you can kind of get that there's a coherence of warmth, right? That you can say about this green. This is a warm green. It's a warm yellow. This is a warm pink, like a salmon pink it might be, right? Same with this. Another, Marie Cassatt's paintings are gorgeous because they're just like these quiet moments, you know, the in-between times, which is kind of how I like to think about it. The stuff that nobody thinks is very photographic. Is also Marie Cassatt. Marie Cassatt. Now check this out. So this is a little bit different. She has kind of a cool yellow here, and then there's also dominantly cool colors. I'll go over cool and warm colors more. This is Piet Mondrian. Piet Mondrian he was very absorbed into a philosophy called theosophy, and theosophy was a little bit of a blend of some of the scientific understandings of the world, symbolic understandings, and so his paintings, you may have seen some of these before, some of the paintings will have these blocks of color, and each one of the verticals, the horizontals, and the colors all had symbolic meaning. I have no idea what that is. This is Dorothea Tanner. Tanning, Dorothea Tanning. She was a surrealist painter. I'm just showing you all kinds of cool stuff. Also Dorothea Tanning, I think. This is Sonia Delaunay. Her husband became really famous for very similar paintings. This is a guy named Joseph Albers. I didn't finish talking about Paul Klee in the Bauhaus, but Joseph Albers was another teacher at the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus was an art school in Germany in like the mid-20s, and that was at a time when Hitler and the very right-wing party of political party, I forgot what they're called, the National Socialist something party, which basically became the Nazis, started to gain power. And they wanted to make sure they were moving more, obviously more toward a hyper nationalist, and then also xenophobic and then racist ideology. A number of the artists in Bauhaus were not following the rules, and Walter Gropius, who was in charge, had to just kind of float this whole school along against the Nazis, but he had to kind of play it safe because I think it only lasted like 6 years or something, and it's one of the most influential art schools around that there people look at, where there was a systematization of again, like the hands and the mind, and it was looked at as it was, instead of an old academy education, it was a new way of thinking about teaching art. Joseph Albers was a color theorist and a painter in the Bauhaus, and one of the things that he did, these are called homage to the square, and he's done like, I don't even know how many of these kinds of paintings. They're not very big, but believe it or not, each one of these squares is meant to be looked at sort of in phases. So for example, it has to do with color relativity, and the color relativity. So for example, if I just sort of block my eyes out and look at this part, I can look at the color relativity of the weight of this, this, and this in their same intensities across. If I vary the intensities, right? So if it's bigger, you can start to look at the difference in the way that the colors change depending on what's adjacent to it. So he did a whole series of squares where he could look at how color changes based, one color can change how it looks based on another color. I'm sure you guys have probably seen things like that online, where stare at the green dot and then you take your eyes away. But colors can look completely different when they're next to other colors. Whereas if I were to take this square out and just put it on a black field, it would have a different presentation to your eye. Because what Joseph Albers figured out, and also what the Impressionists figured out, was that color has a relativity. So that certain colors will look more or less intense based upon the other colors that are around them. And not only that, and this is what Joseph Albers was doing with the homage to the square, not only will different colors look differently or appear differently when up against a different color, they will do so in varying degrees based upon the amount of color. So if you have a little bit of red and a big bunch of orange, that red will have a different kind of appeal or a different visual. Your eyes will be seeing the same color, but your brain will be thinking it's slightly different. This is Moreau. So Hesiod, these are Greek myths. So remember that the symbolists were these artists who were mixing both the kind of biblical and ancient Greek mythology. I think this is Robert Rauschenberg, but I don't know. I have to look at my notes, guys. I don't see my notes. This is Matisse. Now this is, remember when I was talking about colors that were kind of analogous, or that they were a scheme, or that they were tonally around the same? Matisse starts to play around with colors that really started to, Matisse was a guy, and this is about 1880s. Matisse was a guy, a painter, who started to use colors in ways that were unconventional. And the French, he started a group of artists called the Fauves. And the Fauvism just meant these sort of wild beasts, right? Because the colors were just so gaudy and so crazy to their eyes. To us, we're like, oh, no big deal. But back then, when you're used to seeing a bunch of gray, you know, kind of Renaissance type colors and a bunch of saints walking around in their robes. This was like completely out of whack. It almost bordered on pattern as opposed to space, you know, like using two dimensions to represent a three-dimensional space. And so in this case, the three-dimensional space is implied. It's not represented per se, it's signified, which means that, like, so for example, you look at this thing here, you understand that as a three-dimensional decanter of some kind, maybe of wine or juice. But in fact, like, just there's no real use of shadows to indicate any kind of a space. The only thing that's being used here are these flat shapes that we read as something. And that's different than trying to trick the eye using shadows. The other thing I wanted to point out is that color scheme wise, tonally, these are more or less kind of similar. However, there is some intensity difference, right? So when you look at how much red is on there, it makes that blue really pop. Another trick that sign painters would use, I love this painting. I think this is a girl with the green eyes. This is also Henri Matisse. Just look at how these colors vibrate off of each other. So it's not real common that you're going to get artists who up until this point would push these really beautiful primary colors against their complements, tertiary complements and stuff like that. So where, you know, the Cubists were playing with space, Matisse is also playing with space, but he's using color to really go for it. This is also Matisse. And this is more of the Fauvists. And what the Fauvists would do, they would invert colors. This is an artist named Claude Monet. And he was an impressionist. And the Impressionists were a group of artists that were around from like 1840 to 1870s or so. And I was talking about them before, where they were artists who were trying to capture the light, the moment, right? And so this is a cathedral. I think this is Chartres Cathedral. This is one version of Monet's. This is another version. So what the reason why they're kind of like blurry or more kind of daubed is because they were kind of invented this way of painting called en plein air, which just means outside. And they would literally take their canvases outside and their paints, set up, and usually up until that point, artists wouldn't go out necessarily and just that would be their final. That would be like a color sketch. So for example, if I was, let's say I was a painter of horses, I might go to like a corral or something like that, or I might go find somebody with horses and I might just spend the afternoon drawing horses. I take the drawings back to my studio, and then I would refine the drawings, and then I would refine the light and all that kind of stuff. But the Impressionists went out, and they went out to try to record what they were seeing at that moment, and that was the artwork. Here's another version. So you can see these are all different times of day. I suppose if you lived there and you had seen this church change colors in different lights, you might even be able to guess what season it was. Another piece by Moreau. Pissarro was another of the Impressionists. And again, here he is out. It's winter. It looks like these are the shadows. Oftentimes they would plant these trees called poplar trees as windbreaks. They still do that. Like if you guys drive through Central Valley, California, you'll drive by some like farmland, and you guys ever see those big giant trees that are growing along one side? Those are windbreaks. This is Alice Neal. Again, using color, using the human body, a pregnant woman. This is Matisse. Again, I'm kind of jumping around, but look at how bold the color is there. And this is Monet. So this really borders on, you know, this is the same boathouse that we just saw. It's like a cafe that's out on a river or lake. That's the same one that we saw with Renoir, where all those people were having drinks. This is the same thing, just a little different point of view and much quicker. So one of the goals of this painting was to really capture this like beautiful kind of maybe early morning or like early afternoon light. No, this is not blurry. It's in focus, and this is an artist named Mark Rothko. Mark Rothko was a painter who lived in the not early, but like mid 20th century. He became famous in like the 40s, 50s, and 60s for doing paintings. He was part of a group of, or movement of art called the abstract expressionists. And the abstract expressionists were a group of artists who did two types of large paintings. One style was called the color field painters, of which Rothko was a member. And the other groups were called the action painters, of which Pollock, Jackson Pollock with the drip paintings, Willem de Kooning and others were there. And so Mark Rothko experimented with huge layers of different thin oil paint. And what he was trying to do was kind of ultimately get the most abstract painting that he could, but also communicate some kind of emotion. These paintings are big. They're like 4 feet by 6 feet, or 8 feet by 6 feet. They're huge. And they're really meant to sort of almost be like a room, like where you walk in, you stand in front of it and you're looking at these colors. And over time, they kind of start to create their own environment. And a lot of times people go to see these paintings and they have some kind of religious experience. I don't know, I haven't quite had that yet, but they are very beautiful to look at and just be in the presence of. The other thing that's really key to these is their scale. I think that if these, like for example, this piece right here is quite large. It's at least as tall as I am, and which is like 6, 7 feet tall. And when you see something that big, it's really, it leaves an impression. If this were like a small piece, it might look more like a paint chip, that you might get at the paint shop for painting your bathroom or something. So scale also plays a really important role. This is another Mark Rothko. And this is a terrible slide, so I'm gonna get, but most of these slides are terrible because it's just really difficult to capture. You can see there's a lot of artifacting in this one, but they are mostly just fields of color. And as a counterpoint to that, you might have somebody like Mondrian, who, again, that Theosophist painter who was doing these kind of grids. This is called Broadway Boogie Woogie. And again, and I think this is, I don't know what this represents. It could be the lights of the street or the lights of streetcars or cars coming down but it's not representational in the sense that we're used to. This is an early Pierre Mondrian. Looks like it's from 1918. This is Odilon Redon. He became really famous for making this little blobby spider guy. So sometimes, there's an artist named Larry Pittman. I didn't put any of his work in here, but it's really amazing. I'll show you some next time. But he's an LA artist and uses really cool color patterns. Maybe I can bring it up for you guys afterwards. The Death of the Gravedigger. Again, this is Matisse. I think we can probably, you guys are probably bored by now, but I can go through this and I can put it into our lecture, but I'll go through quickly. I just wanted to show you kind of a little bit of a closer look at Odilon Redon and how some of the early drawings that he did, developing his own language. And that's the thing, if some of you guys are going to go on to continue with art, if you're an art major, one of the benefits of making more drawings, making more work, even if you don't think it's good, not every piece has to be a masterpiece. Most of the time when you do work, you're kind of developing a language, a visual language of your own. So over time, Odilon Redon starts to develop a real kind of a habit of representing things that becomes his style. I mean, every single one of you guys have your own style. At this point, I can almost look at your drawings and guess whose it is, because everybody's hand has its own kind of signature mark. I can imagine that over time, he started to become really fascinated with the way colors can have a spatial dimension. So if you were to look at this on your screen, I realize we have different screens, but the color, this Carillion blue right here, this blue here, this purple, the red, and even some of this turquoise here, if you sort of blur your eyes a little bit, you'll notice that it kind of pops forward out of the picture. And then there are other colors that kind of recede, visibly recede, and you can see some of these, the yellows and the oranges back here kind of receding a little bit. So he's starting to develop a pictorial language of color that has some relationship to colors that recede, like say this kind of muddied color here, back here, and colors that pop forward, like the base, some of this orange, this white, and this kind of pale blue-gray. This is also Renault. This is all the same artist. So again, looking at this color here, look at how it pops forward. And this is probably more like what it would look like in real life. I just boosted the color to try to get it so that it would work. Really amazing. And you realize he's just using chalk. And one of the things I think that became really fascinating about Degas and also him is that it took him a while to figure out how he fused down his chalk. There's this stuff called spray fixative that you can use. I don't have any to show you guys. I'll have to buy some. I think I left it at the art studio at school. But chalk pastel is very fugitive. It's going to kind of come and go. And over time, what'll happen as you work with the chalk is you'll realize that your paper can only absorb so much chalk because there's chalk already on it. In which case you have to seal that chalk and sort of create almost like a separate. But these are just some of the. I just thought I would show this because these are the colors that. This is a subtractive color model, right? This is Paul Signac, and he was a fauvist. And one of the ways that he started to play around with color was creating these. This is Theo van Riesenberg. This is these are fauvists, and they started to play around with this compositing of colors. So instead of drawing out like the cliff or whatever, what they would do is they would compose or build the drawing with pure color. So they weren't putting down a sketch and then going at it. They were literally creating the thing as its finished, form as they were going along. So it was kind of going against some of those norms that we've been taught, which is like if you do a sketch and then you kind of work it, you erase, you go back. Well, these guys are just like, screw it, we're just going to go for it. But beyond that, what the fauves did was they would invert color. So, for example, like they would use the complement color of the shadow. So if, for example, if we inverted these colors, this might actually have been a dark green on the river, right? And this, so if you started to invert the color. So what the fauves did was instead of painting what they saw, they painted the inverse of what they saw. I think this is an artist named Vlaminck. And so the colors are not meant to represent reality. The only thing that they were really meant to represent was the energy that they were vibing from that particular space.